Welcome to CarFling Asks, to our third installment. I'm Richard. I'm the Head of Innovation for DealersOnline. And today I'm going to share the learnings of the last 4 years that I've had coming to grips with the online auction marketplace for used vehicles in South Africa. I'm going to share some of the insights, the tips, the tricks, and the ways to be able to get the most out of the platform. I think the thing that I've come to appreciate the most about DealersOnline is the auction. I think it's the lifeblood, the heartbeat, it's the plumbing. It actually is what makes the market work in a lot of ways. And it's kind of like the refuse disposal or the garbage. They're very important parts of society, and without them, essentially rubbish would collect. Obviously, it's not the most appropriate metaphor because used cars are not rubbish. They're very valuable. But I think just the importance and the need for the service within the industry is something that I just wanted to highlight. And something that I not completely understood as well when I first started was, how do these cars move around the country? So if you were to take, for example, going into a dealership and trading in a vehicle, that dealership most of the time is not necessarily going to have a consumer for that vehicle because that profile of vehicle might not be for their customer. But they obviously want to sell you the new car, which means they have to essentially trade in your car. But what do they do with it? How do they get rid of it? And how do they make sure that they're able to transition that vehicle to its next life, to find the next buyer for it? If it's not going to be an end consumer, who's it going to be? And that's typically where traders, as we call them in the industry, have always operated. They've also provided this essential service, which is effectively like being the connective tissue between the dealerships to be able to help make the stock flow while the vehicles are in the market. So if you've got maybe a slightly older vehicle, higher mileage, at a sort of VW franchise dealer, they might not be able to sell that on their used car floor because there's a risk that the end consumer or customer of that VW dealership might, have an issue, or it just doesn't meet their OEM standards, which means that they would often need to sell it to another dealership that could potentially have an end consumer or customer for that vehicle. So DealersOnline, when it initially started out connecting these dealerships and allowing them, or giving them the platform rather, to be able to trade vehicles that they weren't planning on being able to retail to end consumers. And what that meant using the auction mechanism was that it allowed for a very transparent and fair way for a vehicle to find the right price. Because when you're looking at a used vehicle, there's a lot of uncertainty around what that vehicle's worth. That's always going to be a subjective thing. What's an asset worth? Well, what are you going to pay for it? And what are you going to pay for it is depending on what value are you going to get from it. And if we look at our customers within the dealership network, they get value when they resell that vehicle and they make money reselling it to an end consumer. So I think that's an important thing to be able to understand is the next buyer, the next owner of that vehicle, how do they get value from it? So the dealership network and connecting the dealership network through an online auction platform really did bring about a lot of efficiencies, because if you think about it, the end consumer ultimately benefited enormously from these dealerships being able to cooperate and collaborate together effectively to be able to move vehicles to the right segment of the market, the right tier of the market that's appropriate for the right customer. It meant that a dealership could pay a consumer more for their vehicle, knowing that they had the ability to be able to sell that vehicle for a higher price because they could tap into the demand and the competitive dynamics of the online auction marketplace to maximize what that vehicle is worth at any point in time. So it gave them the confidence to be able to trade, to do better deals. And I think what was very interesting was understanding and hearing some of the stories about, how do you get buyers confident to buy a vehicle without seeing it, trusting only what they see online. That's a major obstacle. But it was a very important one, because if you think about it, like that really does open up the market. And the more buyers, the bigger the market, the more competition, the better the prices that, the sellers are likely to be able to achieve. The more attractive the marketplace comes, to sellers to sell vehicles. Obviously, the more vehicles available on the marketplace, the more attractive it comes to buyers. And so it's a virtuous circle. But getting that started off in the beginning, I think, was incredibly challenging. And I think that really does underpin the core philosophy of the business around trust and transparency. And that was being able to describe the asset in as much detail as possible. So that the person looking at, even though they're looking at it from hundreds or maybe thousands of kilometers away, is able to trust what they see online is what they're going to get in real life. And with that, they'll be able to make their bid and say what they're prepared to pay. And when you look at who's prepared to pay the most, and the only way to know that you got the best price is to find out what everyone is prepared to pay. And if everyone says what they're prepared to pay, then the market actually decides what that vehicle is worth. As long as there's trust, then that vehicle will be able to find the right price. And auction works exceptionally well, particularly when you're able to describe the asset. And I think with the digital tools we have available, the ways of being able to categorize damage, the various different pricing data points that we're able to provide, you're removing as much of the information asymmetry, which is just pretty much a fancy word for one person knowing more about the vehicle than the other, and as a result, benefiting in some unfair way. If you're able to put both buyer and seller on equal footing so that they both understand the condition of the vehicle, its history, and the current market-related conditions that are influencing the price that people are prepared to pay, you're going to allow more transactions to occur at better prices, or at fairer prices. Maybe the best way of saying it is at the right price. And the market moves. It does. There's so many factors that influence what a vehicle is worth. And that gets me to the part I love about used vehicles, which is a used vehicle is one of one. It's unique. So a new vehicle, they're all like for like. Their life hasn't begun. We all kind of start out our lives as very similar things, but, through our experiences, through the various different influences and environments, we tend to become our own people. Used cars tend to become they take their own shape. Each is unique. I think because they're both functionally complex and emotionally complex. By that I mean is that there's a lot that can, a car does a lot of things. You can tow a caravan, tow a boat, you can take kids to school. There's obviously like safety, there's a lot to it. You think about the different types of cars, from, racing cars to, 4x4s. But then the other component which makes it very interesting is that this is an emotional complexity to the purchase as well, not just a functional consideration, which is what cars say about us and our sense of identity. And I think that's something, because there's such a significant purchase, because they signal so much about what we value, that in some way, it says something about who we are. So when someone's deciding to buy a car, they're not only considering, the functional parts of what the vehicle needs to do to meet their requirements, but they're also looking at what is this vehicle going to say about them. And then you add the used car component where, it's functionally complex, it's emotionally complex, but then there's also, it's got its own life and history. So I think what's quite interesting here is that when you're looking at what a vehicle is worth, you always have to consider like who's going to buy it and, what are they going to do with it. So if you looked at a rental vehicle, let's say that's been used for e-hailing, and they put 50, 60, 70,000 Ks on that vehicle in a year, bearing in mind like the normal mileage that someone would put on is between 20 and 30,000, like on average. And at that you'd get to 250 at kind of 10 years. An Uber driver or a vehicle that's being used in e-hailing is going to do all of its life in a very short space of time. So you're always considering, okay, well, what happens to that vehicle? So, a lot of the time it can be repaired. particularly for major components. So yeah, gearbox, engine, suspension, brakes, those components are replaceable and can be kind of repaired. So you can put a new engine in a vehicle, you can put a new gearbox. And if that's happened, when you come to sell that vehicle, you note that, people pay more because then they know they don't have to do it. But you tend to know that at certain points in a vehicle's life, certain things have to happen, more or less. And that obviously varies from make to make, from model to model. There's a likelihood, everyone knows that they're going to die at some point in time. The question is when. It's the same for kind of a vehicle. Every vehicle will reach the end of its life. But we can say with a fair degree of certainty that, there's a number of different stages. So typically you look at the rental companies, they buy vehicles new from the manufacturers, they sell them at 1-2 years old. That vehicle enters its next life cycle. Typically the fleet companies, so for instance like a Westbank fleet or an Avis fleet, who lease vehicles to like a BAT, so a corporate, they'll dispose of the vehicle after 4 years, typically at 120, 140,000 Ks. There's still a very good life left in that. But when you're using an e-hailing, you're doing, all of that in 1 year or 2 years or 3 years, the vehicle might seem young, but it's aged, it's lived a life. And it gets down to the timing of when do you decide to sell, of knowing exactly what that optimal point is and knowing exactly who's going to buy it, what they're going to do with it, what they need to do to get it onto the road again and in use. I think the e-hailing particularly it is very interesting. There's potential, in my opinion, for a manufacturer to enter the market with a very specifically designed vehicle for e-hailing. Modular components, looked at being able to drastically reduce the cost of maintaining that asset. But I think it's would someone get into that car is another question, or be seen getting into that car is a completely different question. So another thing is safety. Yes, you can cut costs, but the South African roads also notoriously unsafe. So very different context when you're looking at being able to navigate within a city, where low speeds, first world country. It's a very different dynamic from driving, from Cape Town to Stellies, So I think that's where there's completely different needs. Is the market big enough here to necessitate the need to be able to design a vehicle for that particular context? So how's that going to shape up, particularly in South Africa? I don't know. Some things for sure is, people are always going to need to sell cars. Cars and assets are always going to need to go from one life to the next. And the question is, how does that happen? We see it as our duty to make the marketplace and industry more efficient as a whole. And so that concludes the third installment of CarFling Asks. Look forward to seeing you in the next month.